The chandelier above the massive mahogany table in the Sterling Manor dining room cast a glittering, cold light on the 7 perfectly set places. Outside, a gentle autumn rain tapped a quiet rhythm against the stained glass windows, a peaceful counterpoint to the tense, suffocating silence inside. Julian Sterling, the patriarch, a man whose tailored Italian suit looked less like clothing and more like a second skin of power, cleared his throat. He was a man accustomed to silence, the kind that signaled respect, or perhaps, fear. Tonight's dinner was a formal affair, a quarterly tradition meant to reinforce the solidity and success of the Sterling family empire. Opposite him sat Eleanor, his wife of 30 years. Eleanor was the embodiment of controlled elegance, her silver hair styled impeccably, her expression a careful mask of polite disinterest. She presided over the table with a regal air, occasionally correcting the posture of their son, Richard, who looked far more comfortable managing spreadsheets than managing the nuances of a black-tie dinner. "Richard, the acquisition of the Lowell Group is proceeding smoothly, isn't it?" Julian's voice was deep, a resonant baritone that always demanded attention. Richard, 32, and Julian's chosen heir, dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin. "Yes, father. The final papers are set for signing next Tuesday. Their assets will be fully integrated by month's end. A substantial win." Julian nodded, a small, approving gesture. Everything was in order. The dynasty was secure. The evening was predictable. A quiet creak of the door announced the arrival of Mrs. Thompson, the head housekeeper, who supervised the serving staff. She placed a tray of chilled sorbet on the sideboard, her movements practiced and silent. The Sterling staff were invisible, efficient, and discreet, a fundamental rule of the house Julian valued above all else. The tension around the table was not born of conflict, but of sheer wealth and expectation. It was the weight of a lineage that had never faced a public scandal, never suffered a major setback, and never, ever deviated from the path of propriety. Then, the kitchen door swung open again, and this time, the footsteps were hesitant, not the crisp, professional pace of the staff. Every head at the table turned. In the doorway stood Clara. Clara had been Julian's personal maid for nearly a decade. She was quiet, meticulous, and seemingly unremarkable, a woman who existed only in the background, ensuring Julian's shirts were pressed and his study organized. Tonight, however, she was not dressed in her usual crisp, black uniform. She wore a simple, dark dress, and her face, usually pale and guarded, was flushed with a mixture of terror and determination. But it was what she held that stopped the conversation, the sorbet spoons, and the very air in the room. Cradled tightly in her arms, wrapped in a thick, white flannel blanket, was a baby. A newborn. The silence that descended upon the Sterling dining room was not the usual heavy silence of expectation, it was a vacuum, sharp and absolute. Eleanor's hand, reaching for her water glass, froze mid-air. Richard leaned forward slightly, squinting as if his eyes were deceiving him. Julian's expression, however, was the most profound. His jaw went slack, his eyes wide and vacant. Clara took a single, shaky step into the room, then another. Her eyes, usually lowered, met Julian's squarely. She walked directly to the head of the table where he sat, the only sound the soft click of her sensible shoes on the polished marble floor. She stopped right beside Julian, the bundled weight in her arms the undeniable focus of the room. She was breathing shallowly, her voice when it finally came, a ragged whisper that nonetheless cut through the immense quiet like a shard of glass. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice shaking but her gaze steady, "I apologize for this intrusion." Julian found his voice, a low, guttural croak. "Clara. What is the meaning of this? Get that thing out of here." His dismissal only strengthened her resolve. She held the baby slightly higher, its tiny, wrinkled face visible to the shocked assembly. "No," she said, louder now. "I won't. I'm sorry to ruin your dinner, but you need to see him." Eleanor finally spoke, her voice laced with ice. "Clara, this is inappropriate. You will return the child to its mother and leave the premises immediately. You are disrupting a private function." Clara ignored Eleanor, her eyes locked onto Julian. The tears that had been welling up finally spilled over, tracing clean paths down her cheeks. she took a final, deep breath, and delivered the sentence that shattered the Sterling dynasty and froze the hearts of everyone present. "This baby is yours, Mr. Sterling. He is your son." The echo of Clara's declaration, "This baby is yours, Mr. Sterling. He is your son," hung in the air, thick and radioactive. Julian Sterling, a man who commanded the respect of boardrooms and the silence of entire markets, was, for the first time in memory, utterly speechless. His face, normally a stern landscape of sculpted bone and tight skin, seemed to crumble. The blood drained from it, leaving a sickly gray pallor. He shoved his chair back, the heavy scrape of wood against marble a brutal sound that finally broke the spell. He rose, towering over Clara, his hands resting on the edge of the table, knuckles white. You lying little fraud." Julian roared, his voice no longer the measured baritone of a CEO, but the savage bellow of a trapped animal. "How dare you? How dare you bring this fabrication into my house, into my family dinner?" Eleanor, Julian's wife, did not scream or faint. Her shock manifested as a terrible, cold control. She stood up, slowly, her eyes narrowed on the bundled infant, then on Clara. She moved around the table with the lethal grace of a predator, stopping directly beside Julian. "Clara," Eleanor said, her voice dangerously low, stripped of all warmth. "You have crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. You will now tell us the truth, or you will regret the day you ever took a job here." Richard, the dutiful son, was paralyzed. He looked from his father's rage to his mother's frightening composure, then back to the innocent, pink face of the baby who was oblivious to the chaos he had caused. The baby squirmed slightly in Clara's arms, letting out a small, pitiful whimper. Clara clutched the child tighter, instinctively protecting him from the sudden storm of aggression. "It is the truth, Mrs. Sterling. I know you don't want to believe it, but I wouldn't do this if it wasn't the only way. I have been discreet for 9 months, for 10 years of service, discreet." Julian spat the word like poison. "You call this discreet? Interrupting my private family gathering with a vulgar stunt for money. Who paid you to do this, Clara? Which competitor is trying to smear my name? No one paid me." Clara cried, her voice cracking with despair and exhaustion. "I am telling you the truth. His name is Leo. He was born 3 weeks ago. And he shares your blood, Mr. Sterling. I didn't want him to be raised in poverty and shame." Eleanor took a step closer, her emerald necklace flashing under the chandelier light. "Where is the proof? Where is the doctor, the documentation? Anyone can bring a baby to a rich man's house and spin a pathetic tale." Clara reached into the pocket of her dress with her free hand and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was wrinkled and slightly damp, likely from her own tears. "I have a paternity test," she whispered. "I went to a clinic near the city. I used a sample of hair I took from your brush, Mr. Sterling. It's an initial test, but it shows a high probability." She held the paper out, her hand trembling so violently that the paper shook. Julian ignored the paper. He could not look at the paper, because to look at the paper was to acknowledge the possibility. To acknowledge the possibility was to admit a secret he had buried deep beneath layers of respectability and arrogance that he remembered. A brief, reckless night. Not an affair, not a romance, but a moment of weakness, fueled by too much expensive scotch and a sudden, paralyzing loneliness in the massive house while Eleanor was traveling abroad. It was after a particularly stressful acquisition, and he had stumbled into the kitchen, finding Clara tidying up late. She had been quiet, attentive, and surprisingly tender when he needed it most. It was a lapse he had instantly regretted and immediately compartmentalized, paying her off generously the next morning with a veiled threat of silence. He had never spoken to her directly about it again, treating her like furniture, a strategy that had worked perfectly until this very moment. "Take that thing and yourself out of my sight," Julian commanded, regaining a sliver of his executive composure. "I will have my lawyer contact you tomorrow. We will arrange for a private, official, and court-supervised DNA test. If this is proven true, I will deal with it, discreetly. Until then, you will not set foot outside the staff quarters, and you will not speak a word of this to anyone. Not one word. Clara's face crumpled with relief mixed with pain. He wasn't simply throwing her out. He was acknowledging the demand for proof, a tacit admission that something had happened. Where is she to go, Julian? Eleanor's voice was sharp. She cannot stay in the staff wing with that. She looked at the baby with utter disdain. Julian pinched the bridge of his nose, closing his eyes against the blinding truth. The guest cottage. Have Mrs. Thompson prepare the small guest cottage immediately. Clara, you and the child will stay there. You will be provided for, but you are confined. Do you understand? Clara nodded weakly. Yes, Mr. Sterling. She turned to leave, walking past Richard, who finally found his tongue. Father, Richard muttered, his voice hoarse, if this is true. The damage. The press. Julian didn't look at his son. He looked at his wife, Eleanor, whose face was a study in cold, simmering vengeance. The dinner is over, Julian announced, his voice booming hollowly in the sudden, echoing silence. Richard, call my lawyer, George Thompson. Tell him it's an emergency. Eleanor, I need to speak with you. Now. Clara and the baby, Leo, slipped out through the door, leaving behind a battlefield of shattered silver and spilled wine. The Sterling dynasty was no longer secure. It was shaken to its very foundation by the silent presence of a small, unwelcome truth. The moment the dining room door clicked shut behind Clara, Eleanor Sterling turned on her husband. Her rage was not loud, it was a cold, precise instrument of destruction. Julian stood by the ruined dinner table, his tie slightly askew, running a shaky hand through his silver hair. He looked, for the first time in years, completely exposed. Sit down, Julian, Eleanor commanded, her voice dropping to a dangerous monotone. She was no longer Julian's society wife, she was a corporate titan's partner, calculating the damage of a major hostile takeover, which is exactly what this felt like. Julian obeyed, sinking heavily onto his chair. Richard stood awkwardly by the marble fireplace, desperate to be anywhere else, yet unable to move. Let's bypass the theatrics, Eleanor began, resting her manicured hands flat on the polished wood. I do not care how this happened. I care about the consequences. And the consequences, Julian, are colossal. This isn't just about a woman and an unfortunate child, this is about the Sterling name, the stock price, and the board. I know, Eleanor, I know, Julian muttered, rubbing his temples. It was years ago. A monumental error in judgment. It meant nothing. I paid her off, I thought it was handled. Obviously, you handled nothing, she retorted, her eyes glacial. A child is not a debt that can be settled with a check. Richard is supposed to inherit the chairmanship. Do you realize what this does to his position? If you acknowledge paternity, this Leo is entitled to a stake. A claim. A voice. He will get a trust, a foundation, Julian snapped. He will never get a chair on the board. I will tie it up in so many legal contracts that he won't see a cent until he's 40, and even then, only if he adheres to impossible terms. Richard is the heir, no one else. Richard finally spoke, his voice strained. Father, the prenup. Does Mother know? Are you sure this doesn't void anything? The corporate trust structures. The corporate trusts are ironclad, Julian assured his son, though his confidence was wavering. This is a private, personal matter, not a corporate one. The silence returned, but this time, it was broken by the sharp, decisive ring of the front doorbell. That will be George, Julian said, relieved to have an immediate, practical distraction. Go meet him, Richard. Bring him straight in here. George Thompson, Julian's longtime corporate lawyer and fixer, arrived within minutes, his face etched with worry. George was a lean man in his late 50s, whose life was dedicated to keeping the Sterling stain-free. Julian. Eleanor. Richard. I came as fast as I could. Richard's call was alarming, George said, setting his briefcase on a side table. Julian wasted no time. He relayed the events of the evening in curt, brutal detail, omitting only the emotional context of his liaison with Clara. He focused only on the facts, the maid, the baby, the claim, and the preliminary, unofficial test. George listened intently, occasionally stroking his chin. Right. A bombshell, Julian. A very public potential bombshell. We move immediately on 3 fronts. George opened his briefcase, pulling out a crisp yellow legal pad and a pen. First, containment. Clara and the child are confined to the guest cottage. Excellent. No contact with the outside world. No cell phones. We control the narrative and the information flow. The rest of the staff sign new, ironclad NDAs immediately, tonight. Second, the DNA test. We schedule a fully sanctioned, court-admissible paternity test at an independent lab first thing Monday morning. You will provide the sample. We get the undeniable truth. No more hair samples, Clara's testimony, or preliminary results. We need science. Third, the settlement. If the DNA is positive, we move to settle this instantaneously. We offer Clara a substantial sum, enough to secure her and the child's future, provided she signs away all future claims, rights to the Sterling name, and, crucially, agrees to a perpetual non-disclosure agreement with a ruinous penalty clause. We pay for the silence, Julian. How substantial? Julian asked, dreading the answer. George looked him dead in the eye. Enough to make her life comfortable, but not enough to ever challenge you. Given your profile and the public nature of the claim, Julian, we are looking at 8 figures. This is reputation control. Julian flinched, but quickly masked his reaction. Fine. Do it. Just make her disappear. We want full custody of the truth, and she gets the money. Eleanor watched the exchange, her lips pressed into a thin, pale line. When George finished making notes, she stepped forward. George, Julian is focused on the money and the paperwork, she said calmly, cutting Julian off before he could speak. You need to focus on the structure. This is a betrayal of the family, yes, but also a betrayal of the succession plan. She paused, looking at Julian with intense, chilling disappointment. We have fought for 30 years to build this legacy for Richard, Eleanor continued, gesturing toward her son. Richard is the heir. If that baby, Leo, is Julian's biological son, then our strategy changes. Julian, you need to be prepared. If this news leaks, the board will question your judgment. They may question your ability to maintain stability. You may find yourself fighting not just the maid, but a hostile takeover from within your own company. Julian's face tightened with sudden fear. Eleanor had hit the mark. The money was just money, but the company, the power, that was his lifeblood. That won't happen, Julian insisted, though he sounded less certain than before. It is already happening, Eleanor corrected him softly. You just don't see it yet. George, ensure that your legal strategy protects Richard's place above all else. That is your priority. As George Thompson nodded, absorbing the new layer of corporate danger, Julian felt the walls closing in. The small, private mistake from years ago had finally matured into a massive, existential threat to his fortune, his family, and his legacy. He was now battling a mother's desperate love, his wife's calculated fury, and the sudden, silent threat of a corporate coup. The guest cottage was a quaint deception. Though called the cottage, it was, in fact, a small, 2-bedroom luxury annex nestled deep within the vast, manicured grounds of Sterling Manor. It was elegant, well-stocked, and currently, a cage. Clara sat on the edge of the large, plush 4-poster bed, the glow of a single bedside lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The air was sterile and quiet, heavy with the scent of expensive linen and the faint smell of the newborn in her arms. Leo was finally asleep, a small, warm weight against her chest. His presence was the only anchor in the terrifying storm she had willfully unleashed upon the Sterling family, and herself. Mrs. Thompson, the housekeeper, had delivered them personally, her face a mask of strained disapproval. She brought fresh supplies, diapers, formula, an electric breast pump, and a curt warning: the telephone line was restricted to outgoing calls to a pre-approved security number only, and the Wi-Fi had been disabled. They were cut off. Clara hadn't fought it. She had expected isolation. What she had done required absolute silence on her part now. She had delivered the truth, and now she had to wait for the legal machinery of the Sterlings to grind forward. Exhaustion weighed on her shoulders, the kind that sinks deep into the bones after 10 years of servitude followed by 9 months of secret pregnancy and 3 weeks of sleepless motherhood. But beneath the weariness was a hard kernel of resolve. She looked down at Leo. He had Julian's jawline, a stubborn, definitive line even in infancy, and Julian's dark, almost black hair. The resemblance, though subtle to a stranger, was undeniable to Clara, who had observed Julian's habits, clothes, and features for a decade. That I had to do this, she thought, rocking him gently. For you, my little Leo. Clara's own childhood had been a landscape of poverty and chaotic instability. Her mother had been a single working parent, constantly struggling, constantly defeated by the lack of opportunity and money. Clara had seen her family crushed by debt and despair. When she found out she was pregnant, the memory of that crushing hopelessness was a physical terror. She knew she could not bring a child into that world. She could not give him the life she had endured, the threadbare clothes, the gnawing hunger, the constant shame. She had spent 10 years watching the Sterlings live in impossible luxury, seeing Julian discard fortunes on fleeting whims. She knew the power of his name, the protection of his wealth. It wasn't about love for Julian. That brief, desperate night was a regrettable accident, a momentary blur of vulnerability. This was about survival and opportunity for her son. She had exchanged her silence, her job, and her personal freedom for his future. The unofficial paternity test she had done was a desperate measure, a piece of ammunition to secure an audience. She was counting on Julian's desire for absolute control and Eleanor's determination to keep the scandal quiet. They wouldn't risk her talking, they would pay for her silence. That payment would be Leo's shield. She thought of the cold fury in Eleanor's eyes, the sheer, visceral hatred. She knew she was seen as a mercenary, a schemer who had invaded the sacred space of the Sterling family. She was, in their eyes, nothing more than a temporary inconvenience with a high price tag, but Clara was prepared to be the villain in their story, provided her son became the recipient of the settlement. She had always been alone. Losing the tenuous security of her maid position was a small price for Leo's permanent security. "They will test you on Monday, little one," she whispered, her cheek resting against his soft head. "And they will find the truth. And when they find the truth, your life changes." She gently adjusted the blanket around him. The silence of the cottage was oppressive, yet it was the safest silence she had ever known. It was the silence before the legal battle, the calm before the storm of lawyers, documents, and corporate strategies. Clara closed her eyes, clutching the baby like a talisman. She had made her move. Now, she simply had to endure the confinement and survive the fallout, knowing that every harsh word, every legal threat, was a step toward securing her son's path out of the life she herself had been born into. She made one final, silent promise: "You will never have to beg, Leo. You will never be ashamed." The weekend descended upon Sterling Manor like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The usual sounds of a wealthy household, the distant laughter of the groundskeepers, the soft clatter of silver preparation, the gentle hum of activity, were replaced by an eerie, nervous silence. George Thompson, Julian's lawyer, spent the entirety of Saturday morning in the Manor's massive library, a room Julian normally reserved for solitary contemplation and high-stakes calls. George was in full damage control mode. First, he met with Mrs. Thompson, the housekeeper, who was utterly humiliated by the scandal. George issued new, highly detailed non-disclosure agreements to every member of the domestic staff, from the cooks to the chauffeurs. The language was aggressive, carrying penalties so severe they threatened the staff's entire life savings. The message was clear: silence was not just required, it was financially mandated. George, Julian said, pacing the library rug as George reviewed the signed documents. Are you certain we can contain this? The estate staff gossip like schoolgirls. We can contain the facts, Julian, George assured him, folding the papers with practiced precision. But we cannot contain the rumors. By Monday, every major gossip columnist will have heard whispers that something catastrophic happened at your dinner. We must preempt the narrative. If the DNA is positive, we issue a prepared statement immediately, framing it as a private matter that has been fully and generously resolved. Control the spin, control the damage. While Julian and George focused on public relations and legal defense, Richard was consumed by a far more personal fear, the threat to his inheritance. He wandered the silent house, unable to eat, his mind reeling that he had spent his entire life being molded for this succession. His education, his career choices, his carefully managed public image, all were directed toward the singular goal of taking over Sterling Industries. And now, a baby he didn't know, born of a lapse his father had carelessly forgotten, threatened to undo everything. Richard found his mother, Eleanor, in the conservatory, pruning her collection of rare orchids with unsettling tranquility. "Mother," Richard began, his voice tight. "We need to talk about the corporate implications. If the DNA test is positive, he's legally Dad's son. He has a claim. A financial settlement isn't the same as giving up a blood claim to the lineage." Eleanor clipped a dead leaf with a decisive snip. "Sit down, Richard. And calm yourself. Your father is a terrible husband, but he is a brilliant strategist. The money is just the bait for Clara." She turned, laying the pruning shears on a marble table. "The real defense is the corporate structure. Julian's shares in Sterling Industries are held in 3 separate, complex trusts, all drafted before you were born. The beneficiary language is explicit, only the issue born of the marriage between Julian and Eleanor Sterling are automatically vested in the voting shares." Richard felt a slight easing of the tension in his chest. "So, Leo has no claim to the voting power?" "None," Eleanor confirmed, a faint, cold smile touching her lips. "He can inherit Julian's personal liquid assets, his properties, his art. But the power? The company? That is protected. Clara can take the money and the mansion in Barbados, but she cannot touch the boardroom. That is yours, Richard. That has always been mine and your father's promise to you." This consultation calmed Richard, replacing raw fear with a cold, calculated anger toward Clara. She wasn't just disrupting their lives, she was attempting a bloodless coup on his destiny. Meanwhile, the dynamic between Julian and Eleanor had shifted from an explosive confrontation to a cold, functional alliance. They spoke only in clipped, legalistic terms, treating the crisis as a business merger gone wrong. The emotional betrayal was acknowledged only through the vast, aching space between them. They slept in separate wings of the house, communicating only through George Thompson's office. Sunday was the longest day. Julian spent hours staring out the library window at the distant, innocuous-looking guest cottage, a constant reminder of his folly. Eleanor spent the day on the phone, quietly canceling their public engagements for the coming week, citing a fabricated illness. As night fell, the entire family was united by a single, agonizing thought: the results of the DNA test, scheduled for the following afternoon, would either restore their precarious order or shatter their world forever. The silence was the most terrifying sound in the manor. It was the sound of a dynasty holding its breath. Monday arrived, overcast and cold, perfectly matching the mood inside Sterling Manor. The day was divided into 2 distinct parts: the excruciating wait, and the clinical procedure that would decide Julian's immediate future. George Thompson had organized the logistics with the ruthlessness of a military operation. To avoid any public sighting of Julian entering a clinic, or worse, Clara and the baby, he arranged for a highly respected forensic medical service to conduct the sample collection on the estate grounds. A large, unassuming black van, marked only with the logo of the Precision Diagnostics Group, arrived precisely at 2 p.m. and was directed to a private garage near the main house. Julian spent the morning in his study, trying to immerse himself in market reports, but the words swam meaninglessly before his eyes. Eleanor remained aloof, reviewing estate accounts, ensuring that every financial detail was in order regardless of the outcome. They spoke only to confirm timings. At 2:15 p.m., a security guard escorted Clara from the guest cottage. She was dressed in the same dark dress, holding Leo tightly, who was now awake and making tiny, protesting noises. She was led not to the main house, but to the isolated garage where the medical van was parked. The scene inside the vehicle was sterile and brutally professional. Two medical technicians, draped in white coats, set up a folding table with labeled vials, swabs, and paperwork. George Thompson was already waiting, his presence ensuring every legal parameter was met. Julian arrived moments later, accompanied by Richard, who George insisted be present as a representative of the existing heir. The air was thick with unexpressed hostility. Julian stood across the small table from Clara, the baby between them, separated only by the sterile white cloth and George's briefcase. This was not a meeting of potential parents, it was a deposition. Julian did not look at Clara's face. He focused on the baby. Leo, sensing the tension, started to fuss. "Mr. Sterling, Miss Clara," George began, his tone flat and legalistic. "This is Dr. Evans and Ms. Patel. They are certified by the court-appointed independent laboratory. They will be taking samples for the paternity analysis. The chain of custody will be maintained strictly from this moment until the results are delivered." Dr. Evans, a middle-aged woman with a calming demeanor, spoke next. "Mr. Sterling, we will need a sterile buccal swab from you." Julian nodded curtly. He tilted his head back, and Dr. Evans quickly rubbed the large cotton swab firmly against the inside of his cheek. The sample was immediately placed into a labeled vial, sealed with forensic tape, and initialed by George Thompson and Julian. Then came the agonizing part. The technicians turned their attention to the infant. Clara held Leo gently as Ms. Patel administered a similar, gentle swab inside the baby's mouth. Leo cried out, a thin, piercing sound that cut through Julian's composure like a knife. He flinched visibly. It was the first human sound he had heard associated with the potential consequence of his long-ago mistake. As the baby's sample was sealed, George confirmed the process. "Both samples are now logged, double-sealed, and ready for transport. The results, certified by the lab, will be delivered directly to my office tomorrow evening, no later than 6 p.m. Clara finally spoke, her voice still quiet but firm. "I need a copy of the results, Mr. Thompson." "You will receive a copy of the notarized results simultaneously with Mr. Sterling," George assured her. "Everything is above board, Miss Clara. Now, you will be escorted back to the cottage." Julian met Clara's eyes only for a split second as she turned to leave. In her gaze, he saw not the desperate employee, but a determined woman who had played the highest possible stake for her child. There was no triumph in her eyes, only profound weariness and unwavering conviction. After Clara and Leo were gone, Richard turned to his father, his face pale. "This is unsettling, father." "It's over now," Julian snapped, wiping his mouth with a napkin provided by the doctor. "The test is done. All we do now is wait for the answer. George, ensure no one interferes with that van until it reaches the lab. I want complete security." Julian, Richard, and Eleanor, who had watched the process through a window from the library, spent the rest of Monday and the following Tuesday in a state of suspended animation. Business decisions were postponed, phones were screened, and the outside world was put on hold. The results, held captive in a tightly sealed veil speeding across the city, were the only reality that mattered. Until 6 p.m. Tuesday, the Sterling dynasty existed in a vacuum of profound, chilling uncertainty. Tuesday evening was a prolonged, agonizing study in stillness. Julian and Eleanor Sterling sat in the plush, silent waiting room of George Thompson's high-rise office in downtown Manhattan. They hadn't chosen to wait in the conference room, they preferred the isolation of the smaller, less formal space, where the only sound was the low, distant rumble of city traffic 30 floors below. It was 5:50 p.m. Julian was nursing a glass of mineral water, an unusual choice for him. He was a man who usually faced bad news with a stiff drink, but tonight, he needed his mind absolutely clear. Eleanor, draped in a flawlessly tailored black dress, sat perfectly still, occasionally adjusting the diamond cuff on her wrist, a tiny, mechanical gesture betraying her immense tension. "He's late," Julian muttered, checking his watch for the 10th time in 5 minutes. "It is 10 minutes to 6, Julian," Eleanor corrected him, her voice dry and brittle. "The results are due by 6. George is a man of precise timing." The truth was, they both knew that the outcome, whatever it was, had already been written in the genetic code. The wait was merely for the official confirmation, the legal stamp on their fractured reality. If it was negative, they would pay Clara a smaller sum for the emotional distress and the disruption, ensuring her immediate silence and removal. If it was positive, everything changed. At precisely 5:58 p.m., George Thompson appeared in the doorway of the waiting room, holding a slender manila folder. His face was unreadable, the perfect lawyerly mask of neutrality. He had clearly received the delivery moments before. "Julian. Eleanor. I have the certified results from Precision Diagnostics." George's voice was sober, professional. "Let's go into my office." The office was large, dominated by a sweeping view of the city skyline. George placed the folder on his massive, highly organized antique desk. The silence was so profound that the rustling of the folder sounded deafening. "Before I open this," George said, adjusting his glasses, "I need to remind you both of the legal and corporate strategy we established. The corporate trusts are sound, Eleanor. If the result is positive, we proceed with the 8-figure settlement and the ironclad NDA to protect the family reputation and Richard's succession." Julian waved a dismissive hand. "Just open it, George." George carefully broke the 3 official seals on the back of the envelope. He extracted the multi-page report, scanning the cover sheet quickly, then flipped to the final summary page. Julian and Eleanor leaned forward simultaneously, their eyes locked on George's face. George cleared his throat. He did not lead with dramatic emphasis. He simply read the official finding aloud, his voice devoid of emotion. "The DNA parentage analysis of the sample submitted indicates that there is a 99.9999% probability that Julian Marcus Sterling is the biological father of the male infant, Leo Sterling, sample ID, L481. The words hung in the air, clinical and utterly devastating. The number, 99.9999%, was an absolute, undeniable confirmation. For a moment, no one moved. Julian, the billionaire, the man who controlled empires, looked like a statue suddenly cracked down the middle. His hands, gripping the arms of his chair, went slack. "No," he whispered, a sound of profound shock and defeat. It wasn't denial of the act, it was denial of the consequence. The cost, the disruption. Eleanor, however, did not collapse. Her composure shattered not into tears, but into cold, white-hot fury. She rose slowly. Her eyes burning holes into Julian. 99.9, Julian, she repeated, her voice shaking with controlled violence. "A maid. A fleeting, vulgar moment of weakness on your part. And now, my entire life, my social standing, and our son's hard-won inheritance, is compromised by a footnote in a lab report." She didn't shout. She spoke with a terrible precision that was far more painful. "You bought your secrets for decades, and now the price has been called in. It is not 8 figures, Julian. The price is everything. It is my trust. It is Richard's security. It is your reputation." Julian looked up at George, desperation in his eyes. "George, the contract. Start the paperwork now. Get the money transferred. I want that woman and that child to be financially secure, but gone, before morning." "We begin immediately," George confirmed, already reaching for his phone. "I'll have the settlement agreement drafted by midnight. We will have Ms. Clara sign tomorrow morning. We will have her out of the guest cottage by noon." Eleanor watched her husband, this great, powerful man reduced to a panicked financier scrambling to buy back his past. She felt a tectonic shift in her world. The betrayal was real, the child was real, and the family structure she had worked tirelessly to build was fundamentally changed forever. As Julian began a frantic conversation with George about asset liquidation, Eleanor walked to the window, gazing out over the glittering cityscape that Julian thought he owned. She knew, in that instant, that her goal was no longer merely containment. It was retribution. She had to ensure that Julian understood the true cost of his betrayal, and that Richard's place as the sole, unchallenged heir remained absolute. Her battle had just begun, and lastic. Hikai, Clarani Nihai Anlas Mei Imzaladigi v Eleanoran Intikam Planini Devre Saktuga Bolam 8 Al Devam Edioras, the maid brought the millionaire's baby, this baby is yours, and everyone froze. Chapter 8. The price of silence. Wednesday morning brought Julian Sterling to the guest cottage, not George Thompson. Julian insisted on delivering the news and the final offer himself, a last, desperate attempt to control the narrative and assert his authority over the woman who had brought his empire to the brink of collapse. That he arrived at 9 a.m., holding the certified DNA report and the thick, intimidating stack of settlement documents. Clara was waiting for him, seated on the sofa, holding a now calm Leo. She did not stand or defer, an act of defiance Julian immediately recognized and resented. The results are positive, Clara, Julian stated flatly, tossing the report onto the coffee table. 99.9999%. Undeniable. Now we move on. Clara glanced at the report, then up at him, her eyes showing no surprise, only weariness. I knew they would be, Mr. Sterling. Julian leaned forward, his voice a low growl. I'm not here to debate your motives, Clara. I'm here to finalize this. George has drawn up the contract. It's an 8-figure settlement. It will buy you a beautiful house, provide trusts for the boy, and guarantee you never have to work another day in your life. It is more money than you could ever earn. And the price? Clara asked, her gaze steady. The price is simple, Julian said, tapping the dense legal contract. Silence. Absolute, perpetual silence. You sign a non-disclosure agreement that gives up all claims to the Sterling name, all rights to any future inheritance outside of the trusts we establish, and you vanish. You never contact me, Eleanor, or Richard. You never, ever speak publicly about this child's paternity. The penalty for breach is everything you are given. He pushed the contract toward her. George will be here at noon with a witness and a notary. You sign everything, and you are gone by 1 p.m. Do you understand the terms? Clara nodded slowly. I understand them completely. It is the price for my son's future. I accept it. She looked down at Leo, who was now awake and staring up at her with wide, blue-gray eyes, a color that seemed to be a mix of Julian's dark gaze and her own lighter shade. You need to know something, Mr. Sterling, Clara said, her voice rising slightly. This was not a hostile takeover. This was about giving my son a start I could never afford. You may see me as a scheming servant, but I did this for Leo's security. I don't want your name, and I certainly don't want your life. I only want the peace of mind that his life won't be like mine. Julian was momentarily disarmed by her sincerity, but quickly recovered his defense mechanism of arrogance. Save the melodrama, Clara. Just sign the papers. You got what you wanted. He left the cottage, feeling a strange mix of relief and emptiness. He had bought his way out, but the purchase felt hollow, the seed of retribution back at the manor. Eleanor was not waiting idly for the paperwork to be completed. She was already executing the first step of her quiet, corporate revenge. She called Kenneth Vance, a non-executive director on the Sterling Industries board and a man who owed his initial investment success entirely to Julian. Vance was usually a loyalist, but Eleanor knew his true god was stability. Kenneth, Eleanor's voice was warm, yet carrying an undertone of severe seriousness. I'm calling you privately, off the record. Julian has had a medical crisis this week, a severe stress reaction that forced the postponement of the Lowell Group finalization. Vance expressed immediate, concerned sympathy. The truth, Kenneth, is that Julian's judgment is failing, Eleanor continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially. There has been a personal scandal, one that reveals a profound lack of discretion and immense corporate liability. The DNA test is positive. Julian has fathered a child with a housemaid and is now liquidating assets for an astronomical settlement. She paused, letting the shock sink in. Julian is compromised. He is panicked. He is not thinking clearly. If this news leaks, the market will react violently. You and the other board members must be prepared to enact the emergency stability clause. Richard, as the VP and next in line, is the only steady hand left. Eleanor was careful not to demand a coup, only to plant the seed of necessity. She was reframing Julian's betrayal not as a domestic affair, but as a severe corporate liability. Thank you for the warning, Eleanor, Vance replied, his voice shaken. I will speak to the others. We must protect the company. Final exit at 1 p.m., the settlement signing was complete. Clara's signature was on the NDA and the waiver of all future claims. George Thompson had transferred the first tranche of the settlement into a new, anonymous account held by a fiduciary firm. Clara, holding Leo, was escorted to the back drive where a nondescript black SUV waited. She had packed only 2 small bags. She took one last look at the massive, imposing facade of Sterling Manor, the house that had been her prison and Julian's fortress. She felt no malice, only closure. She had traded 10 years of service and 1 night of folly for Leo's future. Goodbye, Mr. Thompson, she said quietly. Goodbye, Clara, George replied, a hint of genuine sympathy in his eyes. Live well. Clara got into the car. As the vehicle pulled away from the gates of Sterling Manor, heading toward the anonymity of the city and a new, secret life, she felt the silence of the contract settle over her. Leo, finally, was safe, back inside. Julian was celebrating his escape, unaware that his wife had just initiated a quiet, devastating counterattack that would soon cost him far more than money. Clara and Leo landed in Vancouver, Canada, a city chosen by George Thompson's firm for its distance, its anonymity, and its comfortable quality of life. The settlement had purchased a stunning, high-floor condominium overlooking the water. It was a sterile paradise, managed by a discreet property firm that knew only Clara's assigned pseudonym and her lawyer's contact. Clara spent her first few days in a daze. She had a sprawling, custom-decorated space, but no routine. The silence was overwhelming. For a decade, her life had been defined by service, waking before dawn, the demanding rhythm of Julian's schedule, the quick pace of the service kitchen. Now, she had only her son and the endless expanse of unearned leisure. She felt like a prisoner in a golden cage. The wealth was palpable, she could order anything, buy anything, hire help if she wished, but the NDA was the lock on the door. She couldn't call old friends, couldn't share her secret, and couldn't establish a community. She was financially free, but profoundly isolated, holding Leo by the window, watching the distant ferries. She repeated her mantra, "It is for him." The security she had bought him was real, tangible. She had traded her voice for his future. This lonely luxury was her price. The executive chill back at Sterling Manor. Julian was experiencing a far more insidious kind of pressure. He had expected a period of tension with Eleanor, perhaps even separation, but he had not anticipated the executive chill that was beginning to creep into his professional life. He arrived at his office Thursday, expecting to take control of the pending Lowell Group acquisition. But his COO was uncharacteristically reserved, his top analyst seemed hesitant, and the atmosphere was subtly different. When Julian tried to schedule a strategy call with Kenneth Vance, the key non-executive director, Vance's assistant claimed he was unexpectedly tied up in high-priority meetings and couldn't speak for 2 days. This was unprecedented. Vance always took Julian's calls. Julian initially dismissed it as coincidence, but the subtle distancing continued. Emails from board members were curt, his authority, usually absolute, felt questioned, if only by silence. Eleanor, meanwhile, was operating with flawless precision. She hosted a small, exclusive charity luncheon, publicly mentioning Julian's sudden, temporary health retreat due to an intense stress reaction. This allowed her to be seen as the dutiful, concerned wife while simultaneously legitimizing the whispers of his instability. She made sure to bring Richard along, presenting him as the strong, steady hand managing the crisis in his father's absence. "Richard is stepping up admirably," Eleanor would say to influential friends, her voice heavy with concern. "It's a great relief to know Sterling Industries is secure while Julian recovers." The corporate infection, the seeds planted by Eleanor were now germinating across the financial landscape. Kenneth Vance had discreetly, yet urgently, spoken to 3 other non-executive directors, all of whom valued stability above loyalty. The narrative was simple and deadly: Julian Sterling's emotional instability, proven by the reckless creation of a corporate liability with a subordinate, makes him a flight risk and a dangerous liability to the stock and the pending acquisitions. They were not yet talking about removing him, but they were talking about activating a management review committee to ensure continuity during Julian's recovery. This was corporate code for stripping him of decision-making power. On Friday afternoon, Julian walked into the library to find Richard on the phone, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Richard quickly hung up when his father entered. "Who was that, Richard?" Julian asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. "Kenneth Vance, father," Richard replied, meeting his father's gaze with a carefully practiced expression of sincerity. "He was calling to check on your health. And he was asking about the Lowell timeline. He seems concerned that the delay might be perceived as weakness." Julian felt a cold prickle of dread. "Concerned about my health? Vance? He's a vulture. He's concerned about the stock price." Julian stared at his son, who looked too calm, too in control. Julian suddenly realized that the resolution he had paid so dearly for, the removal of Clara and the baby, had only addressed the symptom. The real, existential threat was not outside his gates, it was inside his boardroom, and perhaps, inside his own family. Eleanor had ensured that his reckless personal error had metastasized into a legitimate corporate crisis, that he realized with chilling clarity that by buying Clara's silence, he had only guaranteed Eleanor and Richard the time and opportunity they needed to move against him. The confrontation Julian had feared, yet desperately tried to avoid, arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning, 1 week after Clara's departure. He called an emergency meeting in his personal study, locking the heavy oak doors behind Eleanor and Richard. Julian slammed his fist onto his desk, scattering papers. "I know what you've been doing," he snarled, looking directly at Eleanor. "Vance is talking about management review. The board is questioning my judgment. This isn't damage control, Eleanor. This is a corporate coup, and you are orchestrating it." Eleanor did not flinch. She sat gracefully on the edge of a leather armchair, a picture of cold, calculating resolve. Richard stood beside her, his face a mixture of nervousness and forced maturity. "It is necessary management, Julian," Eleanor corrected him softly. "You created an enormous liability and handled it with panic, not strategy. Your lapse in discretion threatened the entire Lowell acquisition and put Richard's inheritance at risk. The board does not trust a compromised leader. They trust stability. And Richard is stability?" Julian scoffed. "He's a boy I groomed. He has no authority yet." "He has my authority," Eleanor stated, her voice hardening. "And the loyalty of the 3 non-executive directors I spoke to. They see Richard as the necessary bridge to protect the company from you." Richard finally stepped forward, his eyes avoiding his father's gaze. "Father, we aren't trying to cut you out. We are trying to preserve the legacy you built. If you step back, take an official, health retirement, the market stabilizes. You remain the major shareholder, but the executive control passes to me, guided by Mother." Julian felt the walls collapse around him. The 8-figure check he wrote to Clara was supposed to have been the end of his troubles. Instead, it was merely the cost of admission to this final, devastating showdown. He had bought silence outside the gate, only to find the real battle was waiting inside. That he realized the terrible, final truth: Eleanor had used his profound, reckless moment of personal weakness to expose his professional weakness. His mistake with Clara had given Eleanor the moral high ground and the corporate leverage she needed to finally claim the power she had always wanted, wielded through her son that he was beaten. The board would side with the appearance of stability, and Eleanor had ensured the appearance was compelling. "What is the proposal?" Julian asked, his voice low and defeated. "You announce your immediate retirement from the chairman role, citing health reasons," Eleanor replied. "You retain the title of founder and chairman emeritus. Richard takes the CEO and chairman position immediately. In exchange, we guarantee the board's silence on the matter of the child, and we ensure the Sterling corporate trusts remain untouchable." Julian looked at his wife, seeing a stranger, a corporate predator who had waited 30 years for the perfect opportunity to strike. He had bought off the Maid, but he had lost his dynasty to his wife. He sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. "Prepare the paperwork, George," Julian muttered, addressing his absent lawyer. "It seems I am taking a very long, very premature holiday." 6 months later, Clara was sitting on the balcony of her Vancouver condo. The sun was setting over the Pacific, casting the water in shades of brilliant orange and pink. Leo, now a thriving, smiling baby, was giggling happily in his custom high chair. Clara was no longer the nervous, pale maid. She was calm, well-rested, and had begun taking online university courses, pursuing a degree in finance, a quiet irony given how her life had been financed. She scrolled through a financial news feed on her tablet. An article caught her eye. Sterling Industries thrives under new, young leadership. Richard Sterling, 33, has steered the company to record profits since his father, Julian Sterling, retired due to chronic health issues 6 months ago. The elder Sterling remains a passive shareholder but has reportedly stepped away from all executive duties, leaving the company firmly in the hands of the younger generation. Clara read the brief mention, and a ghost of a smile touched her lips. She understood the coded language. Julian was overthrown, replaced by Richard and, crucially, by Eleanor. His arrogance had caused his downfall, and her desperate move had simply provided the detonator. She had secured a multi-million-dollar future for her son, entirely funded by the corporate panic of the Sterling family. She was isolated, yes, but free. Leo would never know the name Julian Sterling, nor the shame of poverty. She picked up her son, burying her face in his soft neck. "We did it, little Leo," she whispered. "We won. Now, we build a new life, the silent way." The silence of the NDA was her golden cage, but it was also her impenetrable sanctuary. She was the one who walked away with true freedom and the ultimate prize, a secure future for her son, paid for by the collapse of the Millionaire's empire.